I am Miriam Klein Kassenoff, the director of the University of Miami Holocaust Teacher Institute, as well as the founder of the film series Screening the Holocaust in partnership with the Miami Jewish Film Festival, the Sue and Leonard Miller Center for Contemporary Judaic Studies at the University of Miami, the George Feldenkrais Program, the Holocaust Memorial of Greater Miami Jewish Federation, and my own Holocaust Teacher Institute at the University of Miami. I am so honored on behalf of my partners to be introducing and moderating this evening's discussion on the beautiful film Exit Music with our outstanding guests, Dr. Simon Wynberg and Dr. Brett Werb, director of the music collection at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. Dr. Wynberg is the executive producer of the film Exit Music. I also want to welcome in attendance this evening the CEO of the New World Symphony, Howard Herring, here in Miami, and a beautiful community activist of music and the arts, Kristen Podak. On a personal note, as a child who had to flee Nazi Europe myself in 1941, this film really speaks to me. With that said, allow me a moment to give you some background on our guest presenters tonight who will be in conversation on this glorious film. Simon, am I pronouncing your last name correctly, Wynberg?
That's correct.
Thank you. So, Simon, I've never met you before, and I'm quite honored to introduce you. You are the artistic director of the Artists of the Royal Conservatory, which has established itself as one of Canada's leading cultural ambassadors. Nominated for its third Grammy Award in 2016, the ARC Ensemble has appeared at major festivals in Budapest, New York, the Lincoln Center Festival, Bucharest, Prague, and Stratford, and Washington's Kennedy Center. Together with your research, the ensemble has built an international reputation for the recovery of a growing body of music that was lost or marginalized as a result of anti-Semitism and political suppression. Dr. Brett Werb has served as a musicologist and recorded sound curator. Dr. Werb, am I pronouncing your name correctly? I think I am. He is at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum since 1993, helping to build and organize an archive and reference service used by researchers worldwide. He has programmed the museum's long-running chamber music series, curated its online exhibition of music in the Holocaust, and produced and annotated 4 CDs of ghetto, camp, and resistance songs. Dr. Werb holds a PhD in ethnomusicology, and he has lectured widely and collaborated on numerous theater, film, recording, and concert projects. For tonight's conversation with Simon, Brett, I was wondering if perhaps you could begin with telling us more about the background of Berlin being the center of music creativity in the 1930s, and how during those 12 years of Nazi control, careers of major composer lives were changed due to bigotry and war. Specifically, more about the noted 5 who are highlighted in this film. Brett, I turn it over to you to have this conversation with Simon. And we will do that for about 35 minutes and then leave room for questions and answers.
Thank you very much, Miriam. First of all, am I audible enough?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. This is a very broad question, and it's on the border of my area of specialization, at least to begin to answer it. So I'm going to splinter it a bit. In the first part, well, to deal with Berlin as a center of musical creativity, this is true as long as we distinguish that this is of the German-speaking world, and specifically after the end of the First World War is when this began to happen, culminating in the 1930s or terminating in the 1930s. So initially, and before World War I, this would have been Vienna as the center for creativity. After the end of the war, Austria was reduced from this capital of a huge empire to almost a very small rural nation with few resources. And at the to the north of Austria was the new Weimar Republic, which took a few years to get its footing, but then it was much more socially dynamic and much more industrialized. What you had there, much more populous than Austria. So you would see an exodus of talent from Austria, in particular, since Vienna was the only city of any kind of substantial population. So the resources were quite limited there. Germany had a proud tradition of supporting music. This was considered the most German of the arts, and with many different cosmopolitan centers rivaling one another for, they subsidized their own opera houses, their own playhouses, their own symphony orchestras. Each major town had, and later on their own radio orchestras. So there was a great need for talent then. There was great support for the arts and for music. This was what people did. They loved classical music and they supported it. It was pretty much the popular music. And it wasn't so different from much popular music at that time, in speaking of the 20s. So that's essentially Berlin being the largest city. That would have naturally been the largest draw for people. The brief answer then is economic opportunity was there. And that's what drew people to Berlin. I think maybe as to what became of the talent there who were drawn there, so many people, when, let's say, Schoenberg from Vienna, one of the leading modernist composers, left Vienna after World War I and became an instructor in Berlin. And you could just go down the list of especially Austrian, German, Jewish composers who moved up into Germany. Maybe Simon wants to talk a bit about the later era when we moved from Weimar into the Nazi period.
Yes, Simon. I guess the opening question for you would be, what inspired you to do the film? When did you decide, and what did you see, or what did you hear, or what were you doing when you decided that you had to make this particular film about the composers that had to flee Germany?
Well, there are probably several parts to that question.
Yes.
We'd been looking at a number of composers up to that point, and we had recordings essentially of most of the music that featured in the film, and so that there were some practical reasons for doing the film, in that it helped promote the actual music that were on the recordings that we had already made. So it wasn't totally altruistic, but we thought it would make a really interesting film to tie the composers together and examine how their lives were affected by the advent of Nazism and the Second World War. I mean, what I find so interesting. But before I get onto that, I just want to say that it's very odd to be answering questions from Brett, or be in the position to be answering questions from Brett, because Brett is the person you go to when you need an answer. He's the guru. When anybody in our field has a question that no one else can answer, they invariably phone Brett or send him an email and ask him, you know, how do I do this, or where do I find this, or what happened here? And Brett will invariably have that answer. So to be on the receiving end of Brett's questions it's a little odd. But having said that, what's interesting about the composers that we chose, and in fact all these composers who were marginalized or suppressed under the Third Reich, what's fascinating about them is that when you start to think of what would have happened in the world of music had the Second World War and Nazism not happened, and how their careers would have been affected by it not happening. And you go through the composers that we examined in the film, for example, Miriam Wynberg, no relation as far as I know, but he would probably have ended up being a virtuoso pianist touring the world, because at the time, initially, he didn't really have much ambition to become a composer. That came later, and very much as a reaction to the experiences that he had. And when you look at someone like Korngold, you wonder what would have happened to the film industry here, and how American movie scores would have fared without the influence of Korngold. So there's so many questions that are that arise because of what happened, and you know, it obviously was a cataclysmic event, but when you look at it with hindsight, you see how the world changed because of that, and not necessarily for the worse or for the better. I mean, in terms of livelihoods and casualties, clearly a disaster, but in terms of how music spread across the world, it's an extraordinary thing to think about.
Brad, even though you're the expert, now that I understand that, I turn it back to you to continue the conversation on questions that you might have regarding the film. So I turn it back to you.
Okay, well, thank you, and thank you, Simon. I was looking desperately for the blush suppress button that I'm sure that they have here in Zoom, and I'll make sure I got it ready, because in case any more come my way. No, I first of all really appreciate your suggestions of alternative history here. What if is a very big question. This runs, it's a thread in musicology, really. And you look for those composers who maybe died young. You look for now, especially look for marginalized groups. And what if the opportunities had been offered them at the time? Women composers, African American or African composers. And this then was applied starting in the 1980s with the group of Jewish composers or politically suppressed composers whose career paths were thwarted in Europe during the 1930s, owing to the rise of Nazism. What I find really wonderful about the film is how, as you say, you selected this group because you'd already had some interest in the composers and worked around it. It turned out to be quite an interesting spectrum intergenerationally. And that was really important. Could you tell me then, apart from, let's go to Braunfels. I believe he was the oldest.
Pretty much, yeah, probably. Yep.
Yeah, so this section was particularly fascinating about Braunfels, someone who was completely settled and not Jewish or not identified as Jewish, who was able to survive without leaving. I was really fascinated with the family interviews. how did you locate his family, and were they always as cooperative as they seem to be in the documentary?
Yeah, his is it his granddaughter? No, it's a while since I've spoken to her, but yeah, his granddaughter has an archive of his material, and it was very easy to contact her, Suzanne Bruce, and she appears in the film. I mean, I think what's fascinating about Braunfels is that he was his father was technically Jewish, but had converted to Catholicism, and then Braunfels himself, Walter Braunfels, had converted to Protestantism. So you know, but essentially there was enough Jewishness in his background to make him persona non grata for the regime. And in fact, when they had asked him at one point to write a kind of piece celebrating the Nazi Party, and he categorically refused. And at that point, he kind of blotted his copybook, and throughout the war, he spent his time really keeping his head down. But they knew where he was. You know, as you can see in the film, they knew where he was. I mean, they had tabs on him, and this idea that he was hidden by the village, which was a kind of a sort of myth that perpetrated for many years, that he was hiding in the war and being looked after by sympathetic Catholics, was absolutely untrue. I mean, the Reichsmusikkammer knew exactly where he was. They just chose to leave him alone. He was a major figure in German music, and he was Jewish, but and his kids still served in the Wehrmacht, and and then after the war, he was seen as this valuable moral asset and applauded, and he's given his old post back. But of course, by then he was he was out of fashion, and the avant-garde didn't want him anywhere near them. But I mean, it's his is probably the most fascinating story in a way,
because it's so complex.
Yeah.
And again, he's being half Jewish would have, under other circumstances, sent him off to a camp. His children would certainly have been disqualified from serving in the Wehrmacht. There's a lot of threads there, but the music was what sucked you in, and it was very tantalizing to hear the few excerpts in there. And I realized when seeing this movie again for the first time in many years, was how little you use it as a promotional device for the recordings that you've made. They're alluded to, but you could have held up product. And I kind of wish you would, because if anybody who's following this film, just because it threads together so many interesting stories, owes it to themselves to locate these recordings and immerse themselves in some of this music.
In a sense, those composers were really, they are pretty well established now. Braunfels is represented in the catalogue. The only one perhaps who isn't is Adolf Busch, who's really remembered as a player rather than a composer. But even he has some compositions out there. But the composers we're looking at now are truly unknown. I mean, unknown in the sense that no one has heard a note of their music before we've put it out. And that to me is the most exciting part of this business, is retrieving music and bringing it out. And of course, you were with me when we looked at the works of Walter Kaufmann. In fact, once again, Brett was the one who led me to this completely unknown composer, and as a result, a recording of Kaufmann's music was made.
We'll circle back a little to that, because I actually, another composer who was not one of your five, but who you mention, who gets a hearing at the beginning, at the end, is Fiddleberg.
Yeah.
And he's not German, and me have studied in Germany, but he's a Polish composer, and this is another group that awaits a larger uncovering apart from Wynberg. So I think maybe just to complete the film, or a little bit, or maybe just the executive version, could you give us a little background on how you came to find Fiddleberg?
That's a good question. A lot of these composers I've stumbled across in in lists that you'll find. I mean, for example, the Gericke book that was published by the Nazis of
Lexicon.
The Lexicon of Jews in Music, and it's a very thorough, as one would imagine, catalogue of Jews in music at the time. Now, Fiddleberg isn't in that because he's because he was a Pole, and he was in France he was in Paris when the Germans arrived, and he fled Paris for New York. But I think I came across him through his father, who was an eminent conductor, and I was reading about him, and then I came across the son, who was this composer, and who had, I think, played percussion in his father's orchestra when he was a child, or when a very young man. And then I followed him up, and of course, as with so many of these composers, their music is, once you know what you're looking for, is really easy to find. Fiddleberg's archive is in the New York Public Library, but no one had really gone into it and decided that it deserved to be played or even assessed. So I ordered some scans, and it really couldn't have been easier.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's the crazy thing about the subject, is that often the music is not in someone's steel case at the bottom of the garden or in an attic somewhere. It's in a major public library, and no one has bothered to look at it in a major public archive.
And of course, sometimes it doesn't turn out to be a treasure trove. There were many Midland composers to choose from, or there are some who really managed to supersede their own expectations at times and come up with one or two wonderful works. Fiddleberg died young, unfortunately, and it seemed to have been really connecting with the American scene when he was composing. And this is a sad story and not an unusual story, but it's just wonderful that you were able to bring back this young talented composer to some recognition with your recording.
Well, there's a lot more of his material too, and of course we're a chamber ensemble, so we don't really touch the big orchestral works. But for any orchestra that has a little bit of ambition and is prepared to take some risks, there's a treasure trove of material out there.
I think that the ARC has really was one of the first permanent ensembles with the mission to discover and record this repertoire, and there are more and more such initiatives worldwide. In Poland, there have been certainly, and another one of your composers who's not mentioned here, Polish, would be Simon Lux. Maybe you want to describe it. He's a Jewish composer who studied in Paris like Fiddleberg, but who ended up with an interesting career trajectory, if you'd like to elaborate in the camps.
Yeah, I mean, Lux is we haven't really approached his music that much when the film was made, but he is certainly what one would describe as a Holocaust composer, but a Holocaust composer who actually survived. He survived the Auschwitz camp, where he was the last conductor of the men's orchestra, and he was shipped out to another couple of camps, and then he finally, on the famous death march out of Brett, help me here. What was the last camp?
I think he was he at Buchenwald at the end?
It might have been Buchenwald, but anyway, there's this horrible death march, and at one point, you know, the soldiers who were monitoring their progress just vanished in the night, and so they were free to leave, which he did, and he walked back to Paris and immediately started to compose. I mean, quite extraordinary, really. So the string quartet that he wrote, which was then later turned into a piano quintet, he finished in Paris in late 1945. Yeah, I mean, what's fascinating about Lax, of course, is that he has none of the opinions that you normally associate, you know, when you think of music and the Holocaust. He thought that the role of music in Auschwitz there was absolutely no value to it whatsoever. That his role as conductor of the orchestra was helpful in keeping the instrumentalists alive, but they did nothing to help anybody else, except of course,
in terms of what they call spiritual resistance.
Exactly. There was no spiritual nourishment. There was nourishment for the players in the sense that they were better treated than the inmates who weren't in the band. But apart from that, he wrote a wonderful book, which is extraordinary, very, very unusual and dramatic in its content, called Music of Another World, which came out originally in French, I think.
Yes, and it was probably the first musician's memoir.
Exactly.
From the period, and came out in French and has been translated to English, and I believe was published as early as the 70s or the 1980s in English.
Yeah.
Also produced many other books in French and in Polish. He lived as an expatriate in Paris, and in fact gave up music for quite a long period of time. But it would be a name really unknown. And I mean, other than the memoir, I hadn't heard much of his music, just some songs. He wrote some songs to Polish poetry about the experience. And until Simon's recording, you really, until the Arc Ensemble's recording, you really wouldn't know that this was quite a fine craftsman and also a very inspired composer. Recommended.
I have to say something else.
LAKS.
Brett has left this out of the story, but as I recall, you know, what was it? I don't know, 15 years ago, you actually sent me the score of the piano quintet and said, have a look at this. And I programmed it, and I thought, this is not a bad piece. And it sort of sat there for a while. And then, you know, when we did the recording of Lax, we came, and it's a work that really has real legs, because we played it in Poznan and also in Warsaw, and because it's based on Polish themes, the audience went absolutely crazy. They thought it was miraculous, and of course the story behind it, his story, is kind of overwhelming. So
it's an interesting phenomenon that so many of these, speaking of the Polish composers, they really embraced Polish as opposed to Jewish folk music. And you see this again and again. And Lax's, the themes he used are from folk songs that would be known to every Pole to this day, and which certainly doesn't inhibit the re-embrace of this music back in the home country.
Before you ask the last question to this fascinating conversation, I would like to have the audience start putting their questions into the chat. We will have one or two more questions from Brett, and then we will start answering some questions. So we'd love to see what you're thinking, what you're asking, what you're commenting. And I just wanted to mention at this point that we did show The Passenger the Miami Opera here and the Art Cultural Center did show the passenger opera here about 6 or 7 years ago because I was asked to work on it from the education point of view. May I ask one question about that, Simon?
Of course.
What made him decide to take the point of view in that opera from the non-Jewish victim rather than from the Jewish victim?
Oi,
Mhm.
you know, I don't think that he saw it in Jewish or non-Jewish terms. I think, and first of all, he was adapting a novel that had already been written. So he was essentially working um, from a set piece, as it were. Brett, can you elaborate on this at all?
It was a radio play originally by one woman, Sophie Posmish, who's still alive, close to 100 now. And she had been essentially the protagonist there, obviously very fictionalized. And it's set on an ocean liner. This wasn't the exact case for her, but she's actually spoken quite a bit about what led to this. She was encouraged to novelize it in terms of educational opportunities. It is really fascinating to understand how the Holocaust was narrated in the communist bloc countries. So that in Poland and in the Soviet Union, where Posmish was, or the Soviet Union where Wynberg was living, you didn't speak about Jewish victims. These were victims of fascism. So both Posmish and Wynberg had to couch their artistic treatments of the theme this way. So what you've got now is a sort of a springboard for explaining what the subtext is, the Jewish subtext, and what the systems were that they had to work under, a repressive system that succeeded the occupation, the previous repressive government. So this sort of explains why there's no overt Jewish subtext to the
even though it was written, I mean, it was written well after Stalin's death, and I mean things were beginning to relax a little bit. But it's very similar to the First Symphony of Dmitri Klebanov, who got into serious trouble because the dedication of the First Symphony is to the martyrs of Babi Yar. And of course, that was seen as absolutely intolerable because the idea was that Soviet citizens had died in Babi Yar, and to specifically, identify a Jewish component of that was seen as absolutely unforgivable. So he got into terrible trouble, and it was just the fact that his wife was quite influential, and I think she got him out of the trouble.
We're talking about an earlier Babi Yar symphony than the famous one by Shostakovich.
We're talking about written in 1945 and banned in 49, I think.
And Shostakovich ran into trouble half a decade later for treating the same theme. So it was taboo in the Soviet Union, and in a sense, it's still controversial in Russia and in Poland again. So, Klebanov, did you want to talk a little bit more about this project that you're recording to come, or whatever else, Simon? This will be my last question to you. What's next?
We've just recorded an album of his music, which covers about 30 years of his compositions, 2 string quartets and a piano trio, and wonderful music. And he's known a little bit in Ukraine, but outside of Ukraine, not at all. He was Jewish, but a Ukrainian nationalist as well. In nationalism in the old sense of the word, rather than in the in the more reprehensible sense.
Mm-hmm.
So his music really, I think, it well deserves, resuscitation. He was a chum of Shostakovich as well, and I've been in touch with Klebanov's son, who lives in Moscow. So
Mm-hmm.
it's always lovely to have these familial connections to the people that you're researching and reviving.
Yeah. So the Klebanov, you've got the Walter Kaufmann, which is a fabulous story. If you just wanted to explain his path to exile.
Kaufmann is his story is.
Simon, would you mind speaking up a little bit? Your
Sure.
voice is dropping. Thank you.
So these are composers not in the film, but these were for the next film.
Well, yeah. Well, I actually like to do a whole documentary about Kaufmann, who was Czech. He was born in the days before Czechoslovakia was actually a country in its own right, which it was, of course, very briefly. And then he studied in Prague, and he was friendly with all the Prague, the intellectuals of Prague at the time. And then when Nazism arose, he fled to India, and he'd always been fascinated with Indian music, and he lived in Bombay for 12 years until the end of the war. And then he lived in London for a while. Then he moved to Canada, became the first conductor of the Winnipeg Symphony Orchestra, a town that Brett has connections with, and then ended up.
Many people in Miami must have connections with.
Absolutely, that's why they're in Miami.
Mm-hmm.
And he ended up at Indiana University, and his archive is in the Cook Library at Indiana University, and it's absolutely astonishing music, because it's this wonderful mixture of Western and Indian music, and his story is just quite extraordinary.
What years was he at Indiana? I went to Indiana.
He was in Indiana from about 1957 for about 20 years.
I was there in 1957.
You probably meet him.
Mm-hmm. Simon, you must interview her for the documentary.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
I remember taking Music 101. This has been absolutely fascinating, a really high level academic education for somebody like me. And I would hope people in the audience, we do have one question, so I'm going to let Brett handle that. If you want to pull up and open up, or do you want me to?
I've got it open. It's from Tara Lisa Bauknight, I guess, or Bauknight. Why does there seem to be a limited discussion about musicians during this time period? I wish we were in dialogue so I could ask you to elaborate on that. Do you mean our discussions here, or a discussion in the general histories of music? Well, let's say it's from the latter. And this is true, and this is the objective of Simon's project, which is to bring this history into discussion, to throw some light on it and ask those questions and try and provide some answers. These composers, many of them did not have a chance to make the impression, to rise or fall according to what would be normal circumstances. They're now given a shot at it. Simon, want to elaborate?
Yeah, I think for every person who left Europe and went somewhere else, for all those emigres, every one of those stories is unique, and because we're all completely different and we have different outlooks on life and different problems and hang-ups and insecurities and needs, we all handle these things in a different way. So you find that some people, some composers, came to United States and really thrived. There were very few of them that happened to, because they probably had something within them. And I'm thinking particularly of Kurt Weill, who came over immediately, saw the situation, changed his musical language, adapted immediately, and took full advantage of the new land. And I think he was built that way. And then for other people, they arrived, and Zemlinsky, for example, immediately fell into an acute depression, said he didn't even want to be buried in New York. And that it runs the gamut of that. So, but I think in the main, people often found it very difficult to reinvent themselves. First of all, there was the fact that your family was still in Europe. Many times there were loads of people, and you had no idea what was happening to them. So that was the first problem. The second problem was that unless you had decent English and an English that was appropriate to where you were living, you had no means of real communication. And there's a whole, the social norms that were proper and appropriate to Europe were completely different when you arrived in somewhere like, Los Angeles. So everybody handled this in a different way. But I don't think one should underestimate the problems of forced immigration. Voluntary immigration is a different thing, but when you're actually forced to leave and forced to go somewhere because you can't get in anywhere else. I mean, a lot of people would have liked to have gone to France, but they couldn't get to France, so they had, so Kaufman knew that he could go to India because it was very easy to get a visa. No one wanted to go to India, but there were a few visas left. He could go. I think that is it's suppressed a lot of music, not only in the country but without the country, and that was made worse when, as I describe in the film, the avant-garde really became they were the kind of the prow of the ship, and everything else was in the wake and treated as a kind of a really backward-looking and really irrelevant in many ways. So I hope that kind of begins to understand the question.
It's a many complexioned situation, and naturally, we understand that there were so many celebrated musicians who made the transition. You talked about Korngold specifically in the film. I don't know whether you'd call him a voluntary or forced exile. It's certainly left a lot behind, but he came and found his fortune in the States. But for each Korngold or Kurt Weill success story, there are dozens, if not hundreds, of composers who you never heard the name, and you may never hear their names.
I think there are two more questions, Brett, that you might want to address.
We have a question from Susan Spear, and she says, thank you. Okay. Seeking out Jewish musicians, I understand there are lists and a few books, but what about the many musicians who had converted over the years since the time of Mendelssohn? Are those being considered? And then we'll get to Mr. Karpel's question in a moment.
Sydney is a Miss Karpel.
Oh, Miss Karpel.
You wouldn't know that, but I do.
The answer is yes, and as to conversion, certainly there were multiple conversions, and unfortunately, I think we were forced to rely on the nationalist socialist system of defining race, and so Braunfels, whose father had converted, is considered a Jewish composer. Those who converted for reasons to get a position, let's say Mahler or Mendelssohn, whether that was voluntary, it was probably not on Mahler's part. He needed to get the work. they were still regarded as Jews under the Nazi system, and yes, these composers are all being considered.
And Sydney's question was, shall I read it aloud
Yes,
to you?
please.
Okay, that's easier for me, I think, to see it. Has ARC played any music rediscovered by the Italian conductor that is searching for lost music in Europe? He was recently featured on CBS 60 Minutes last year. Did you see that program? Did
I did
either
a
of you?
cameo on that program.
Oh, okay, apologize.
I can handle it, or Simon. It's about ARC, but okay. Well, there is some overlap in repertoire. Francesco Votoro's mission is to record or collect all music by all prisoners in all camps, in all theaters of war during World War II. So it's something that he set out to do that he knows he'll never complete, but it's ongoing, and he's issued, I believe, 24 CDs. There is some overlap in the classical repertoire, but he's much more expansive. He'll do operas, and he'll do popular songs, and he'll record music written by British prisoners of war in the Philippines. And so this is essentially a completist project. The degree of curatorship is quite different, but I think there is a little bit of overlap.
And Susan and Alfred Feingold are asking, Nazi Germany was rule-based. We know the story of degenerative art. How did the Nazis define Jewish degenerative music? Simon, do you want to take that one? And please make sure you speak up a little bit.
It's a very easy question to answer. The fact that you were Jewish made your music degenerate. It didn't matter what you wrote, whether it sounded like Beethoven, or whether it sounded like Schoenberg or Xenakis. It by definition, if you were Jewish, the music you wrote was degenerate. There was this assumption that Jews were incapable of authentic composition that was not borrowed or stolen or imitative of something else. So that's really it's a straightforward question to answer in that sense. Okay,
Brett, do you have a comment on that?
Well, the definition was malleable depending on how much the particular composer's music may have been valued. So the non-Jewish composer Bartók was being wooed by the Reich as an Aryan type whose music might be played and promoted. He instead insisted that he be labeled degenerate. He was so vigorously opposed to the regime. A composer like Stravinsky as well could have, but he was mistaken for Jewish for quite a while, as was Sullivan of Gilbert and Sullivan. They thought that this was a Solomon, so they tried to ban Gilbert and Sullivan for a while, mistakenly believing that.
Well, not a lot of people know this, but it's actually, they were actually Goldberg and Solomon. But I do know.
Now it can be told, but it shouldn't leave Miami.
Sonia Fuentes has an interesting comment. She says, "Thank you, Mr. Wynberg, for the interesting film, and both of you for today's discussion. I am a Holocaust survivor, a public speaker, a lawyer, feminist activist, and I was struck by Mr. Wynberg's comment that every refugee's experiences were unique. I never thought of that before, and I will remember it." I just want to make a comment on that, if you don't mind. Indeed, every refugee, whether it was musicians fleeing or my family, my father was a rabbi fleeing, is indeed a completely different story. So I just thought I'd make a comment on that, if you don't mind, since it's the only thing I really have any knowledge of in this discussion this evening. Brett, do you have a comment on that, or Simon?
No, thank you for the question. It's a beautiful
Thank you.
comment. Mhm.
I think the other part of the question is that a lot of refugees had a varying response to where they were coming from. Some of them, realized fairly early on that Hitler had some very evil plans, and there were others who simply refused to believe it, and they were extraordinarily surprised when things got as bad as they did. And there were a lot of people who stayed because they couldn't believe
Yes.
that things were going to get as bad as they did. And I think, for an emigre, they took a lot of those feelings with them, that sort of disappointment, disbelief, and distrust in what they had thought was really their homeland. I mean, the Jews who thought of Germany as being as much a fatherland as any non-Jew.
Thank
Many
you.
of them had fought for Germany and Austria during
Absolutely.
the First War.
Yeah.
That happened in our family. My mother had a twin sister, and she begged her to come with us when we were fleeing. And she said, no, what'll happen to you here to me will happen to you on the road. And we escaped, and she ended up in Auschwitz. So relevant to what you just said. I also wanted to make a comment on the educational value of the first question from Susan Spear as to why these stories are not told. I have found in my 30 years of teaching the Holocaust to teachers and training teachers on what they should teach, that although for years the Holocaust study has always fallen to the department in public schools of social sciences, I began spreading that out and now inviting every teacher of every discipline, because in each discipline that they teach, there is a historical relevance of the Holocaust. There's Freddie Hirsch, the story of his spiritually saving children through doing his physical education. There's math, very relevant, science, very relevant, and music is extremely relevant. So now I invite all arts teachers to come to the trainings, all music teachers. And this film is a perfect film to show to teachers where they can even take excerpts from it that are relevant for the music classes. So I really wanted to contribute my comment educationally about the value of the subject and the film. If there are no more questions, I think we're reaching the time limit of this particular Zoom discussion. And Brett, I can't thank you enough. When I first contacted you and heard about you, your contribution to this discussion was invaluable. You asked fabulous questions. You're a great interviewer, even though you're the expert. It's the expert that often is the best interviewer. And Simon, it has been my real honor to meet you. I saw the film twice, and I thought it was beautifully done. I thought the photography was very, very beautiful. And you told the stories of the 5 composers very well. I hope that one day when this pandemic is over, I can have the honor and opportunity to meet both of you personally here in Miami.
That would
So,
be
Or here in Washington. And
it's always a pleasure to leave Toronto in February or March.
Simon, where are you exactly? Are you in Toronto?
I am downtown Toronto, and it's freezing cold.
Well, actually, I was supposed to be there for the Liberation 75 conference where I'm speaking as a child survivor with Marilyn Sinclair. And that whole thing got canceled last year. And now it's canceled again, but we're doing it virtually in the first week in May. But I have every intention of one day coming to visit. So once again, I want to thank all of our
Thank you for the
participants.
invitation.
Yeah.
It was absolutely my pleasure to work with you and to meet both of you. And as I always say, bracha and lehitraot, and hopefully we'll meet again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the wonderful
you.
conversation.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye now.